What if, what really scares us isn't showing us reality as it truly is, but more like we're wearing these unseen glasses and everything's colored with shades of fear.
That's a powerful starting point.
Think about how that might play out in your own life,
Yeah.
right? The little assumptions we make, the way you read into an ambiguous email or maybe a quick glance from someone.
Yeah.
It feels like a really fundamental question about how we even perceive our world, doesn't it?
It absolutely is.
And that's really what we want to dig into today. This idea that our perception isn't just like passively receiving stuff, it's actively building our reality.
Yeah.
Especially when fear gets involved.
Exactly. It's less about our senses being faulty cameras and more about our minds actively, constantly organizing this flood of information, making it meaningful.
So imagine those invisible glasses again, the ones we talked about, tinted with apprehension.
A great analogy.
That's the kind of shift in perspective we're hoping to explore.
Mm.
And maybe by the end, folks listening might get some surprising insights into why certain things trigger them. Maybe even find a fresh way to look at those anxieties.
Well, it's fascinating how easily this whole organizing process can be swayed, not by, say, faulty eyesight, but by our inner emotional state. And fear. Fear is a particularly potent influence there.
Okay, let's get into how fundamental this perception thing is. I remember reading about this classic experiment. Someone wore goggles that flipped their vision upside down for weeks.
Ah, yes, George Stratton's work, a landmark study.
What actually happened, and how does that, well, frankly bizarre scenario maybe shed light on how our fears might be shaping our view?
Right. So Stratton lived in this completely inverted visual world. And initially, as you can imagine, it was utter chaos, total disorientation.
Okay.
But here's the incredible part. Over time, his brain started to adapt. His perception actually began to reorient itself. The upside-down world started to feel, well, right side up again. It shows us something really profound about the brain's adaptability, neuroplasticity,
Okay.
Now, think about persistent fears. Could they be acting in a similar way? Not flipping your physical world, obviously, but subtly rewiring how you interpret things, turning neutral situations into potentially threatening ones.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
So instead of the physical world being upside down, our emotional world, our interpretation, could be constantly tilted towards threat.
Precisely.
And this idea you mentioned that perception is active organization,
Yeah.
that's key here, isn't it? We're not just passive sponges.
Exactly. Gestalt psychology really hammers this home. We don't experience the world as just isolated bits and pieces. Our brains are constantly grouping, structuring, creating meaningful wholes.
Right.
Like when you look at a picture, your eye immediately picks out the main subject from the background. That's figure ground.
Good.
Or how your mind fills in the gaps of a broken line to see a complete circle. That's closure.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And what's really insightful here is how fear can become sort of the dominant principle in that organizing process. It influences what we focus on, how we complete those incomplete pictures.
You mentioned filling in gaps. The way we see shapes in clouds seems like a perfect example. You and I look at the same cloud, we see totally different things. Our minds are just trying to make something recognizable.
Spot on. That cloud analogy is perfect. Our brains are just wired to seek coherence, to make sense of things.
So how does fear hijack that tendency?
Well, when information is ambiguous or incomplete, we naturally try to resolve it, based on past experiences, expectations, and crucially, our current emotional state. When fear is present, it tends to rush in and fill those gaps with potential dangers, worst-case scenarios. So a friend takes a bit longer than usual to text back. In a fearful state, that might instantly get interpreted as anger or disinterest.
Instead of just, maybe they're busy.
Exactly. Instead of just a busy day, fear provides a swift but often really negative kind of closure.
It's almost like our brains are just scanning for danger signals constantly. And when we're anxious, we're way more likely to see them, even if they aren't really there. There's that term, isn't there, pareidolia? Seeing faces in toast or whatever. How does fear kind of exploit that in our social lives, making us think someone's judging us when they're probably just, I don't know, thinking about lunch?
Yes. Pareidolia is a great illustration of that inherent pattern-finding tendency. Usually it's harmless, even playful, but when fear is the dominant lens we're looking through, that tendency gets amplified and misdirected, especially socially.
Right.
We might start reading neutral expressions as critical. Ambiguous comments become personal attacks. We might even perceive hidden motives where there are none. Fear pushes us to find a coherent story, And sometimes that story becomes one of perceived social threats, even if it's mostly manufactured by our own anxiety. The brain's on high alert for social danger, seeing shadows everywhere.
This really makes me wonder about why some people seem to handle stressful situations so much more easily than others. Some folks seem constantly on edge, while others stay relatively calm. This Gestalt idea that for some people, fear is the dominant figure. That's really interesting. Can you explain that in, everyday terms?
Sure. Think about it like this. At any given moment, what we're most aware of, what really stands out to us, that becomes the figure in our perceptual field. Everything else just recedes into the ground.
Okay, makes sense.
For someone dealing with chronic anxiety, fear itself can become that dominant figure. Their attention gets hyper-focused on potential threats. Their interpretations are filtered through apprehension. Their whole experience of reality gets colored by this persistent unease. Everything else, neutral possibilities, positive interactions, they just fade into the background. They're less salient.
While someone calmer just has a different figure taking center stage.
Exactly. They have a different dominant figure, which allows them to perceive a broader range of information, interpret ambiguity with less of a bias towards threat. It's all about where their natural focus tends to land.
There was another analogy in the notes. Faulty night vision goggles. How fear seems to amplify certain signals, the threat signals, while dimming others, like safety signals. It distorts our sense of what's actually important or safe.
That's a good way to put it.
Can you elaborate on that, how figure-ground segregation gets skewed by fear?
Imagine normal perception is like a well-balanced soundboard, right?
Yeah.
Different frequencies are adjusted appropriately.
Yeah.
Now, when fear kicks in, it's like someone just cranks up the volume on the threat frequencies. A sudden noise becomes definite danger. A stranger's glance feels hostile. And at the same time, it's like they turn down the volume on safety signals, on the reassuring things in the environment.
So the danger pops out.
Right. This skewed figure-ground segregation means potential dangers leap into sharp focus. They become the dominant figure, while things that could offer comfort or a more balanced view just recede into this unnoticed ground. Our perception becomes disproportionately focused on what we fear.
And that other idea about staring directly at a bright star,
Okay.
actually making it harder to see. That counterintuitive thing.
Yeah.
Fixating on fear actually obscures our view of real risks, maybe even opportunities.
Precisely. Our attention, our mental bandwidth, it's limited. When we become fixated on a particular fear, it just consumes so much of our resources. This intense focus can paradoxically make it harder to see the situation objectively, to see the bigger picture, identify solutions, or even notice opportunities that might be right there.
It's like tunnel vision.
Exactly, like having a spotlight so intensely focused on one tiny spot that you miss everything else happening in the room. Sometimes a more peripheral view, a less direct engagement with our fears, can actually give us more clarity about what we're really facing.
It's fascinating, though, that these fear-tinted glasses, as we're calling them, they probably evolved for a reason, right? To protect us from actual dangers.
Oh, absolutely. Our capacity for fear is deeply ingrained. It's a survival mechanism, honed over millennia, heightened alertness to a predator, crucial for survival.
But now,
the threats we face are often different. Social anxieties, work pressures, money worries. These abstract, less immediate concerns can still trigger those ancient fear responses.
so it's like an oversensitive smoke detector.
That's a perfect analogy, constantly signaling danger even when there's no actual fire.
Right.
There's a mismatch between our evolved wiring and our complex modern environment.
I remember reading an anecdote about someone with social anxiety who felt like they were wearing sunglasses indoors.
Yeah.
Fear magnifying something that was already there, like maybe a natural sensitivity or empathy.
Yes, that highlights another aspect beautifully. Fear doesn't just distort. It can also magnify underlying sensitivities or even truths we'd rather ignore. In that case, perhaps a natural empathy became amplified into a source of social pain under the influence of anxiety. Fear has this dual nature. Sometimes it projects illusions, other times it highlights uncomfortable realities. It really forces us to consider our own perceptual habits. What shapes do we consistently see in life's clouds?
Okay, so it's not about trying to just get rid of fear, which feels impossible anyway.
Right.
It sounds more about understanding how it influences what we perceive, the shapes we see, and starting to question if those shapes are accurate.
Exactly. That's the first step. Cultivating awareness, recognizing fear's role in shaping our perceptions. Just knowing that our experience isn't always a direct, objective reflection of reality, but an active construction heavily influenced by fear that allows us to step back. To question our first interpretations, explore other possibilities. It's about developing a kind of meta-awareness of our own perceptual habits, those recurring threat patterns we tend to see.
Okay, let's dig deeper then into this architecture of fear. These underlying psychological mechanisms you mentioned. We talked about figure ground. How does fear specifically grab control of that dynamic? How does it force itself into the foreground?
Well, think back to that image of a forest, maybe with a deer hidden somewhere. In a calm state, your attention might just wander right. Trees, light,
I'm
sound.
just taking it all in.
But when fear arises, it's like a sudden, intense spotlight snaps onto any potential sign of danger. A rustle in the leaves, a moving shadow. Fear hijacks that figure ground dynamic. It makes any potential threat the most salient, the most attention-grabbing thing in your experience. Everything else, including reassuring details or the bigger picture, fades into the ground, less noticeable, less impactful.
And this isn't just random, right? It seems connected to how our brains, like simplicity, stability, that law of trignance you mentioned. How does fear exploit that drive to categorize things quickly, often into just black and white boxes, safe or dangerous?
Fear operates on speed, urgency. When faced with a perceived threat, a quick judgment often wins out over careful, nuanced thought. The law of pregnance, our drive to organize things into the simplest, most stable forms, fits perfectly with that urgency. Fear tends to collapse complex situations into these binary categories. Safe, dangerous, friend, foe, threat, no threat.
Which can be useful sometimes.
Life-saving, even in moments of genuine danger. But in less critical situations, it leads to a distorted, often inaccurate view. Ambiguity and nuance are actually key to a better assessment then.
We also talked about the principle of closure, our brains wanting to complete incomplete patterns. And the really interesting point was how fear rushes in to fill those gaps with negative assumptions. That unanswered call means something bad.
Exactly right. We have this inherent drive for closure, to resolve ambiguity. When we're anxious or scared, that drive gets amplified. But the information we use to complete those pictures, it's biased towards negative possibilities.
So we jump to conclusions.
We jump to the most alarming conclusion. Instead of considering a range of perfectly normal reasons for the unanswered call meeting, dead phone, forgot fear leaps to, they're angry, there's been an accident, something terrible, it provides a quick but often inaccurate and distressing sense of closure. It reduces the discomfort of uncertainty for a moment, but usually at the cost of a realistic interpretation.
And this seems linked to that feeling of unfinished business, how fear keeps potential threats buzzing around in our heads until they feel resolved somehow. Even if resolved just means pushing it away temporarily.
Yes, precisely. Unresolved issues, perceived threats, they tend to stick in our minds more persistently. Fear exploits this. There's that psychological thing, the Zeigarnik effect. We remember incomplete tasks better than finished ones. Fear works like that too. It keeps us mentally hooked on potential threats until we feel we've dealt with them.
But dealing with them is often
Often just superficial dismissal. The underlying fear can easily pop back up, keeping us in this state of ongoing low-level anxiety.
Now, what about field theory?
Yeah.
Kurt Lewin's idea of our life space, the sum of all the psychological stuff influencing us. How does fear ripple through that space, interact with memories, expectations?
Lewin's field theory is really useful here. It says our behavior, our experience, is shaped by the entirety of our psychological environment at any given moment, our life space. When fear enters this space, it's not isolated. It interacts dynamically with everything else: past experiences, current situation, future expectations.
So, like with trauma.
Exactly. For someone with past trauma, a seemingly neutral cue, a sound, a smell might trigger a huge fear response because it resonates with those stored memories. It creates a much bigger, more disruptive ripple in their life space than it would for someone else. Fear essentially acts like this powerful force field, influencing how we perceive and interact with everything within our psychological world.
And that other concept, isomorphism, how our internal emotional state actually shapes how we see the outside world. If we feel scared inside, we're more likely to see the world as scary. Have you, noticed that personally?
Oh, definitely. It's subtle, but it's powerful. Isomorphism suggests the structural similarity between our inner psychological state and how we perceive the external environment. When fear dominates our inner landscape, it really does act like a filter, coloring our interpretation of everything around us. A crowded room feels more menacing. A casual remark sounds critical.
It's not that the world changed.
No, not objectively, but our internal state of fear projects outwards, shaping how we interpret neutral or even positive things. What we feel inside tends to become what we see outside.
And that just creates this feedback loop, doesn't it? Fear makes us interpret things negatively, which then reinforces the fear, makes it stronger.
Exactly right, a self-perpetuating cycle. If we go into a situation expecting threat, we're more likely to interpret ambiguous cues in a way that confirms that fear. That perceived confirmation then strengthens the initial fear. The more we expect danger, the more we see it, the stronger the anxiety gets. This loop can solidify distorted perceptions until they feel like objective reality. Makes it really hard to break free.
Okay, last mechanism from that section. Attention as a spotlight. How does fear narrow that spotlight? Make us hyper-focused on threats, while everything else just fades out.
Right, our attention is selective. It focuses our limited cognitive resources on what our mind thinks is most important right now. Fear acts to narrow that attentional spotlight intensely, directing it almost exclusively towards potential sources of threat. This hyper-focus on negative cues means we can miss crucial context, positive signals, alternative interpretations. You're so focused on spotting one specific danger, you become blind to everything else, including maybe escape routes or help.
Yet, it feels like a paradox, because while it narrows focus, fear can also create this scattered, hypervigilant state. Constantly scanning, but unable to really focus clearly on anything. It's just exhausting.
That's a crucial paradox, yes. While fear intensely narrows the spotlight onto perceived threats, the underlying anxiety also creates the state of hypervigilance. Our attention flits rapidly, erratically, between different potential dangers. This constant scanning is mentally and emotionally draining. It stops us from engaging in focused, rational thought or effective problem solving. We become reactive, not proactive, always on edge, but unable to really process or understand what we're facing.
Like a faulty alarm system, just blaring constantly.
Exactly, leaving you perpetually unsettled, but unable to pinpoint the real issue, if there even is one.
So, getting to that moment of insight, the aha moment,
Right.
it often comes from disrupting these ingrained patterns, from looking at the structure of our fear, not just trying to push it down, like stepping outside a house of mirrors to see the distortions.
Precisely. Insight from a Gestalt view often comes from a sudden reorganization of our perceptual field. When we're stuck inside that fear-distorted reality, it feels overwhelming, inescapable. The key is to shift perspective. Step back from that immediate fear-dominated experience and start observing the mechanisms at play.
How do you do that?
Well, it might involve consciously redirecting attention, actively challenging those fearful interpretations, seeking out new information that contradicts the assumptions. By examining how fear structures our experience, manipulating figure ground, distorting closure, hijacking attention, we can start to dismantle its hold and see things more clearly.
And practices like mindfulness, just intentionally paying attention to the present moment without judging it. That sounds like a really practical way to start that stepping back process.
Absolutely. Mindfulness, or what we could call phenomenological awareness, is about cultivating this non-reactive attention to our direct experience. The physical feelings of fear, the anxious thoughts, the emotional tone. Just noticing how fear shows up in our bodies and minds right now without immediately slapping a bad label on it or trying to suppress it. That creates a subtle but really significant space between ourselves and the feeling.
So you shift from being the fear to observing it.
Exactly. You shift from being completely identified with the fear to becoming an observer of it. This non-judgmental awareness can help dial down the intensity and create the conditions for new insights, for a more balanced perspective to emerge.
This all leads us to what feels like a real paradox, this idea that fear, this often really unpleasant, disruptive feeling, could actually be like a portal, a gateway to deeper truths about ourselves and the world.
It is counterintuitive, isn't it? But profoundly true, I think. Just like experiencing darkness can make us appreciate light more. Fear, in its intensity, can sometimes illuminate parts of our inner world, our relationship to reality, that might otherwise stay hidden. It disrupts our comfortable routines, our assumptions. It forces us to confront underlying tensions, inconsistencies we might have been avoiding. And those disruptions, uncomfortable as they are, can be powerful catalysts for growth, for a more authentic self-understanding.
And the idea that fear can expose the gaps in our understanding.
Yeah.
Those places where our neat, constructed sense of reality kind of falters, like maybe that weird feeling of déjà vu is just a momentary glitch in our sense of continuity. Could moments of intense anxiety signal a deeper tension between who we really are and who we think we should be?
That's a beautiful analogy. Our everyday perception often runs smoothly, creating this seamless coherence. Fear, especially intense fear, can disrupt that flow. It highlights areas where our inner world might be out of sync with our external life. or our idealized self-image. A sudden surge of anxiety, a panic attack, while deeply distressing, can sometimes be a signal that we're living in a way that isn't fully congruent with our true needs, our values, that there's a fundamental disconnect needing attention. It's a forceful, unpleasant reminder, sure, but a reminder nonetheless to look at deeper, maybe unacknowledged tensions.
The illusion of safety point is really thought-provoking too. How our sense of self emerges through contrast, and fear just blows up potential threats while shrinking our sense of security. And the idea that maybe safety itself is, well, a bit of an illusion, masking the inherent uncertainty of just being alive, that feels quite profound, maybe even a bit scary in itself.
Yes, our perception of safety is often tied to this desire for predictability, for control, which are ultimately elusive, aren't they? In a world that's constantly changing, fear can strip away that veneer of security. It forces us to confront the uncertainties that are just part of being human. And while that can definitely provoke anxiety, it can also be strangely liberating. It can lead us towards a deeper acceptance of the present moment, a recognition that true resilience isn't about rigidly controlling everything, but about learning to navigate the inevitable discomfort and uncertainty of life.
I recall another anecdote about someone with chronic anxiety realizing the storms weren't external threats but internal resistance to change, their glass house of fear becoming a greenhouse for growth.
Yes, that illustrates the potential for restructuring beautifully. It's about a fundamental reorganization of perception. Instead of seeing fear solely as an enemy to be vanquished, the person began to see it as information, perhaps even an ally, guiding them towards necessary internal shifts and greater self-awareness. The fear didn't necessarily disappear, but its meaning and function transformed.
So the journey isn't about conquering fear then, maybe, but about learning its language, understanding its sometimes distorted messages, and how it might actually be pointing towards something important we need to look at. Precisely, it's about shifting our whole relationship with fear, moving from seeing it as an adversary to, well, maybe a potential teacher. Instead of focusing only on suppressing it, eliminating it, we can learn to approach it with curiosity, asking, what might this feeling be trying to tell me? What underlying needs, what vulnerabilities might it be highlighting? Engaging with fear like that can unlock its potential for growth, for self-awareness. Going back to that life space idea, maybe those intense waves of fear are just like surface turbulence. On a much deeper ocean of calm, of resilience, that remains untouched. And the goal is shifting focus to that whole field.
That's a powerful image, yes. It helps us remember that fear, while often loud and disruptive on the surface of our awareness, isn't the entirety of our being. Beneath those waves of anxiety, there often lies a deeper reservoir of inner strength, of stillness. By consciously directing our attention to this broader field of awareness, we can start to disidentify from the immediate feeling of fear. Recognize it as just one transient aspect of a much larger, more dynamic whole. Remembering the wider landscape of our experience, even when one emotion feels overwhelming.
And this seems to connect nicely with some Eastern philosophies, doesn't it? Where emotions like fear aren't necessarily good or bad, just part of the flow, something we can learn to observe, maybe even surf, like a wave.
Exactly. Many Eastern traditions emphasize acceptance, non-resistance to all aspects of experience, including the difficult ones. That metaphor of surfing the waves of fear suggests exactly that, allowing the feeling to be present without fighting it or suppressing it. By observing fear with a kind of equanimity, we can learn valuable lessons about impermanence, attachment, interconnectedness. Fear, in that context, becomes a teacher, guiding us towards greater presence, greater acceptance of the full spectrum of what it means to be human.
And that idea of closure, the paradox.
Yeah.
The more we desperately seek certainty, the further we might get from the actual truth, because life just resists being put into neat boxes.
Yes, there's a deep truth there. Life is ambiguous, complex. Our drive for closure, amplified by fear, pushes us towards simplistic answers, towards certainty. But reality is rarely that simple. Embracing ambiguity, letting go of that need for absolute certainty, can actually open us up. Seeing ambiguity not just as a source of anxiety, but potentially as a space for curiosity, for possibility, for deeper understanding.
So if we revisit that forest metaphor one last time, without the fear narrative dominating, the same forest might be perceived totally differently. Shadows become mystery, sounds become wonder.
Precisely. The elements are the same, the trees, the sounds, the shadows. But the meaning we impose on them changes dramatically when fear isn't the primary organizer. What was threatening can become intriguing. What was alarming can become simply present. Fear might still linger, perhaps as a quiet reminder to stay aware, to be present, but it doesn't have to dictate the entire experience.
So fear isn't the opposite of courage then. It's maybe the foundation for it, acting despite the fear.
Beautifully put. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act, to move forward, even when fear is present. It involves a kind of synthesis integrating fear with other aspects of ourselves. Hope, curiosity, love, determination. Seeing the whole field, not just the fearful part.
So the final thought isn't really about finding all the answers or finally eliminating fear, is it? It sounds more like embracing the questions it raises.
Yeah.
And recognizing that reality, maybe without that heavy tint of constant fear, could be a much richer, more surprising, maybe even more wondrous place than we usually allow ourselves to experience.
I think that's exactly it. Perhaps fear's greatest, most paradoxical gift is its potential to wake us up, to shake us out of complacency and invite us into a richer, more complex, more fully lived reality. Like a Zen koan, it defies easy logic but holds profound insight if we're willing to sit with the questions. The goal isn't a fear-free state, but a fear-aware state, allowing us to navigate life with more wisdom, resilience, and maybe even awe.